What's up, guys? My name is Colin. You're watching The Battle Bridge, and today we're talking about Star Trek Picard Episode 8, Broken Pieces.
She's done it Maddox's way. She's done it my way. Let's try doing it her way, and hope we get there in time to warn them. Actually, I don't know how to work this.
Okay, so right off the bat, holy hell does this episode drop a ton of plot exposition on us. Ancient alien races that were destroyed by malevolent beings after synthetics evolved to a certain point. Re-engineered star systems, the Conclave of Eight, 200,000-year-old prophecies. Soji isn't Soji, or maybe she sort of is, and she comes from a planet of synthetic beings engineered by Bruce Maddox. The confirmation that the Romulans were behind the Mars attack. The fact that Rios' former captain murdered two of these synthetics from this Bruce Maddox planet. It's just a lot to take in all at once, and not all of it is computing just yet.
Processing. Fascinating.
But let's get into the actual video. If you guys have seen any of my previous videos on Star Trek Picard, you already know I got a little gimmick when it comes to episode reviews. I'm not going to talk much about plot points, we're not going to go over things you already know, and we're not going to spend too much time on Easter eggs. What we're going to do is lump everything that happened in the episode, everything significant anyway, into two really oversimplified categories: good and bad. So let's start off talking about that plot just a little bit. Not going over what happened, but whether we like it or not. Look, I actually think the idea of a malevolent force that comes from God knows where when we pass a certain threshold of evolution when it comes to synthetic life is inherently a really cool sci-fi concept, so I'm down with that. It also comes with a ton of questions specific to Trek, like is this an entity or a force that we've seen before in Star Trek or something completely new? I know a lot of you guys out there have theories about Star Trek Discovery, which we'll leave on the table for now. But honestly, my first thought when it was revealed to us that, there was an evil force that came down on this ancient civilization because they made synthetic life too advanced was, okay, what is this threshold? Because we have seen, or at least heard of, advanced mechanical life in Star Trek before. First thing that came to mind for me was V'ger. If you guys have seen Star Trek the Motion Picture, the first Star Trek movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Does V'ger not fit this category? And if not, what about the people who built V'ger? Not the Voyager spacecraft, that was us, but the people who took Voyager when it went into deep space and made it a sentient living being. Surely they would have crossed this threshold and called down Seb Cheneb on them, no? It also makes you think, maybe the Romulans are kind of in the right here? If this really happened, and if there's a really good chance it's going to happen again, maybe synthetic life should be banned. I'm not saying kill the existing synthetic life or harm anyone, but maybe don't make any more. Of course, then you get into the whole problem of synthetic life inevitably wanting to procreate and continue their line like Data did with his daughter Lal, and you can't really stop them from doing that because, well, that would just be horribly unethical, and we've been down that road before. Still, Rios brings up this point to Picard at the end of the episode, and Picard kind of brushes him off and says, fear is the real destroyer, and we have hope and we have optimism, so don't worry, everything's going to be all right. Perhaps not the most satisfactory answer, at least from my point of view, but it made me think of a very similar scene involving Captain Picard of many years ago, when Q was trying to humble him and humble humanity in the face of the unknown of the galaxy. And what did Picard say?
You're not prepared for what awaits you.
How can we be prepared for that which we do not know? But I do know we are ready to encounter it.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. That's why we're out here.
Oh, the arrogance.
Well, to quote Admiral Clancy, sheer effing hubris. Q made him pay for that hubris, that arrogance, and of course introduced him and the rest of the Alpha Quadrant to the Borg. And now I kind of feel like we're going down a similar path. All of this is to say, I'm enjoying the plot and the questions that it raises, which is why it lands in a good category for me. Moving on, I'm just gonna say it. Raffi is the best character in Picard, or at least in episode 8 of Picard. Why? Well, right off the bat, I love her little rant to Picard when he beams back aboard the ship about how he's on this self-concocted righteous redemption arc, because that's kind of how I feel about the macro plot of the show sometimes. So to hear Raffi give him a little bit of a reality check there, well, I really appreciated it, not only from a character development, but from a audience catharsis level. I felt like she was acting for all of us who were watching the show going, hold on, wait a minute, you're doing what now? Obviously, it also makes her just a lot more interesting than if she was just, a Picard underling who does what she's told. And she was great throughout the episode. With Raffi, she's one of the characters in this show, in Picard, that feels, even in season 1, really fleshed out, really authentic. I just can't say enough good things about the character of Raffi, so I'll just stop myself right here and we'll move on to another character who I think had a very good episode in episode 8, and that's Rios. Speaking of characters who get the nod from me for being a little more fleshed out, his entire, I don't want to call it a psychotic episode, but his breakdown with what happens after he sees Soji was adding some much needed depth to his character, who I already liked, by the way. Also, am I the only one who got this vibe? Is it just me, or is Rios's obsession with physical vintage objects like the record player, like the records themselves, the old pictures, the old uniform, the statuettes, kind of reminiscent of Blade Runner, if you've ever seen that movie, or if you've read the book by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? In that mythos, androids created by human beings who are just a few years old have a desperate need to accrue physical tokens of memory. It helps create the psychological barrier they need to exist as fully formed human beings who are just a few years old. And that's what Rios' hoarding of all these old objects really reminded me of. And it is pretty relevant given the entire thematic nature of Picard being about artificial intelligence and androids not knowing they're androids and that kind of thing. Just a little cross sci-fi observation from me. Point is, Rios got some awesome character development in this episode, and he's gonna get a thumbs up from me because of that. Let's continue on the theme of characters, shall we? 7 of 9 is back in this episode, sort of becoming a diet Borg Queen, a Borg Queen light, if you will. Not much to say about this scene, honestly. 7 of 9 becoming a badass, black-eyed Borg Queen is just a cool concept, and it was executed well. And that's why it's gonna land in the good category for me. Now, let's just move on from characters for a little bit and talk about one of the elephants in the room when it comes to this episode, in my opinion, which is Admiral Clancy's F-bomb. Now, I've said in past videos that I am not a huge fan of gratuitous swearing or especially gratuitous violence when it comes to Star Trek. Not that there's anything wrong with those two things in media in general, but just Star Trek itself isn't really about that. And I think it's very important to keep that identity of Trek clear, even when we're going in a new direction like Picard is. Now, that being said, I actually loved it when Admiral Clancy told Jean-Luc Picard to shut the F up. So I'm going against my better nature on this one and putting it in the good category. Why? Well, Picard is on this self-righteous I told you so rant, which is so self-congratulatory it's almost Riker levels of smug, and she just drops that F-bomb on him and does shut him the F up. I mean, look, I love Jean-Luc Picard as much as all you guys do, but the man can get on a pretty damn high horse sometimes. Now let's give a quick nod to some of the references and Easter eggs to past Trek, because everybody loves references. Let's start off with my particular favorite, which was the name dropping of Marta Botanides. Of course, you guys know from TNG, she was one of Picard's confidants and friends at the Academy and went on to an illustrious career in Starfleet. Now, in some of these Star Trek novels, which obviously are not alpha canon, she does go on to become a very high-ranking officer in Federation security, does a lot of crafty behind-the-scenes CIA stuff, actually becomes a bit of a, not malevolent, but not entirely good character either. Just having a Scottish engineer hollow was, I think, a pretty obvious reference to many people's favorite engineer from back in the day, Montgomery Scott. Hey, speaking of Star Trek TOS, did you notice when Soji woke up in sickbay, the background soundscape was very reminiscent of TOS era sounds? Finally, of course, there's a super overt reference at the end of the episode when Picard reminisces about being an ensign aboard the USS Reliant. It was on that ship that Picard served with, among other people, a young lieutenant by the name of Nakamura, who became an admiral, who you later see in TNG with that rank. Once again, everybody loves references, including me. Big thumbs up, lands squarely in the good category. Finally, I want to give a quick nod to the character of Picard and obviously Patrick Stewart's acting. I've talked ad nauseum about how good he is in the show, and I think for a long time he was carrying it, although I think Rafi and Rios might be moving into that role. But anyway, my point being here that his scene with Soji at the dinner table just between the two of them was fantastic, and it's going to land in the good category for me as well. All right, that about does it for the stuff that I really liked in this episode that stood out to me as positive and good for the show. Let's move on to things that I wasn't a big fan of. Remember how I said I really liked the F-bomb that Admiral Clancy dropped on Picard in that scene in the holosuite? Well, it's not the only F-bomb in this episode, and the other one I didn't like at all. Why? Simply because it's gratuitous. It just felt like they were, I don't know, swearing for the sake of being edgy. And again, I'm not against the concept of dropping F-bombs or swearing or vulgar language in media. That's absolutely fine. But I don't think it belongs in Star Trek. I think they actually managed to make it work with the line earlier in the episode, and then they had to just double down and do it again for no reason. It doesn't add to the dialogue, it doesn't feel necessary, it's cheap, and it's a mistake in my opinion. Speaking of trying to be too edgy, I think this episode was getting a bit dark and gritty for me. What am I talking about here? Well, like I said, there were multiple F-bombs, that's fine, whatever. This show, or this episode of the show, in fact, was, you know, particularly physically dark, so they give you that sort of mood of oppression and darkness, which, again, for a single episode, is fine. But there's also a ton of killing in this, and two separate references to suicide. One of which, just like the swearing, I think was completely unnecessary and gratuitous. I think when Rios talks about his former captain taking his own life, it does have a poignancy to it. It does advance that storytelling, Rios's character, that emotional moment. But the next time we talk about suicide with Jurati, it just doesn't seem necessary. She's talking about how when she was given the vision by O of, you know, Seb Cheneb and the apocalypse with the synths, that her comfort was every day she thought about killing herself. Holy shit. Can we just chill a little bit here? Is that really necessary? You already gave us an opening to the show where sentient beings were going so mad from a vision that they were killing themselves by bashing their heads against rocks and ripping the flesh from their own bones. We get it. It's scary. Synths bad. Seb Cheneb bad. Do we have to keep doubling down on it? Do we have to keep throwing around suicide as a casual reference? Again, gratuitous if you ask me. Hey, speaking of Jurati, okay, I like this character a lot in the first half of the show, and I'm starting to turn on her a little bit. In this episode, it kind of feels like she got away with murder, and I mean that literally. She literally murdered Bruce Maddox, and she comes out from her coma, and she's just like, what up, everybody? I know I murdered Bruce Maddox. Oh man, but I went through this scary thing right before that, and I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. She even makes a joke about how I'm done murdering. Again, does this feel very Star Trek to you? I don't know. Maybe I'm overreacting on this a bit, but I found it so bizarre that someone in Star Trek could get away with cold-blooded murder and just walk around like nothing happened. I hope at the end of the series, or rather at the end of the season, that, you know, there are serious repercussions for her. It's not just like brushed under the rug by Starfleet. Finally, Elnor. I know you guys, if you've seen my previous video, especially the last one, you know I'm not a big fan of this character. Look, he wasn't that bad in this episode, but that's because he didn't have anything to do. He just kind of stood there. My one beef that involves Elnor in this episode isn't actually his fault. It's just that when the Zhat Vash or the Romulan Centurions or whoever they're working for, whatever their badges say, attack him, they flashbang him, and then they go in with melee weapons. I'm sorry, you just saw that this Qowat Malat monk dude can cut people's heads off with his sword no problem and seems to be pretty well versed in hand-to-hand combat. Why didn't anyone pull out their disruptors and blast him? Look, not everything in a fictional show has to make perfect sense, especially when it comes to science fiction, but the plot armor on that scene and on Elnor was way too transparent. Anyways, guys, that about wraps it up for my thoughts on episode 8. We only got 2 more of these things to go, so I'm hoping that episode 9 and 10 don't dump quite as much info on us, don't transfer quite as much plot data to us as this one did. I hope we can just let things play out, let characters develop, maybe get a few twists and turns there. And hey, given the fact that Picard was given a squadron, a Federation squadron, maybe we'll get a space battle. That'd be cool. Anyways, time will tell, guys, and I'll be right back here next week to tell you what I thought of the episode and, of course, to hear what you thought about it. And to that end, please let me know in the comments below if episode 8 was your cup of tea or not, and if you disagreed or agreed with my take on the various parts of this episode. Until then, guys, this is Colin on the Battle Bridge, signing out.